Wydrych.
A to jest Anna Gruszcynska.
And this is Anna Gruszcynska. And we have met here in order to have a conversation with Anya. Or actually, more than just a conversation, since it's really going to be an interview. We're interviewing her to record a certain story, Anya's story, and more specifically, her story in the context of her feminism.
Well, when I'm trying to remember, because I've been thinking about it many times, about this question, where it all came from, this interest in gender studies, in feminism, and I have an impression that the very beginning was when I was still in Wrocław. This was between 1997 and 2000, when I was studying at the English department, and when I was a junior. As part of a seminar requirement, we could choose many different courses, and there was a female professor there who came from the States, from the Rhode Island University as a Fulbright scholar, and she taught a course about American and American Indian female writers. At that point, it was like outer space for me. This was a course for which the whole reading list was made up of not just of women writers, but also these were women who belonged to this particular ethnic minority. And this was an absolutely new way of reading, and something I had a hard time with it at the beginning. I have to admit, it was also a bit hard for me to adjust to it all. Later on, during the first semester of junior year, there were many other readings, and the one I remembered the most, I think, was something, wait a minute, by Charlotte Perkins, maybe? Or by Perkins Gilman? I don't know if it was ever translated into Polish, but at any rate, in Polish there would be something like The Yellow Wallpaper. It is a story of a woman who, because of her overprotective husband and because she has some sort of an ailment, is basically forced to undergo 6 weeks of therapy, which basically involves permanent rest. She ends up in bed, in a room with this yellow wallpaper, and lying on her back, she gets slightly crazy. And after this yellow wallpaper, I started reading a lot of things about female hysteria, about inscribing women in this kind of story of madness, story about their ailments, that they are not fully normal, that they're hysterical, and so forth. So I decided to write my bachelor's thesis about Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. The title was so, at any rate, I'm not even able to remember it today, but I'm sure there was something about patriarchy in it, so involved a lot of reading about women and madness. Anyway, at that point I really read a lot of that stuff, and as a result of these readings, I got into the stage of developing a need for some more practical action. And actually, at that point, I reached a stage when I became a bit tired of Wrocław, of the university, the city itself, and my reality there. So I decided to go to another college in another city. I managed to get into the Spanish department in Cracow, and I remember going online and finding information that Cracow had something like a women's foundation. And it wasn't even, I think, eFKa's site, but just some information with only an email, or maybe a phone number somewhere. So when in October I came to Cracow to start my new college classes and adjusted a bit, and I think that was as early as in November, I went to eFKa with this idea that I would do some volunteer work for them. At that point, I really didn't have a clue about NGOs and about organizations like eFKa. And I happened to get a volunteer job taking care of the library, organizing their catalog, preparing their complete list of books. Well, I don't know, it was something like a database. And while working on this catalog, I had another opportunity, after the one at the English department, to read a lot of these kinds of books. And I remember that basically I was reading pretty much everything I could put my hands on, and rather incessantly. And for my first year in Cracow, I was mostly taking care of this library, reading a lot, attending classes. And for the first time in my life, I got kind of socially integrated into the so-called student life there. And basically then, during my freshman year there, mostly as a result of all this reading, but also kind of, you know, between the lines, I managed to figure out something I had been struggling with for the last 5 years. And that is that I was a lesbian. At that point, I was 21, maybe 22 years old, and it was still completely theoretical then. More of a read about it than an experience kind of a thing. Later, I went to the US again. And again I brought back a whole load of books, both gender and feminist books. And among them, there were also lesbian books. It was in 2001, and theoretically, it probably doesn't really matter, but I was in New York on September 11th, and I got caught up in this whole attack, which was an incredible shock for me. In Warsaw on September 11th, as I have learned later, there was a founding meeting for campaign against homophobia. It was around 3 p.m., which means it was 9 a.m. in New York, and when everything was basically falling apart. So the 5 organizers, and at the very beginning it was just 5 guys, were waiting for reporters to show up, but to no avail, nobody showed up. And later on, this date kind of got blurred because it seemed silly to claim it, but I still have this thing stuck in me. And then, basically, I think I was still ruminating over this experience of becoming a lesbian, both in reading and writing. For many years, I had been corresponding with a few girls, and for the most part, these contacts never went beyond the internet. It was all about letters only, just writing, a whole lot of writing. And the funniest thing is that while I was starting the campaign against homophobia in Cracow, I was an absolutely theoretical lesbian, a very well-read lesbian, but nothing beyond that. And probably as a result of all this reading and these ruminations, I came up with this need to move it forward. I found out from one of the women I corresponded with that the campaign against homophobia started a homepage, and they posted this appeal and an encouragement to start local organizations. And at that point in Cracow, there was basically no... I know that there was a lesbian organization, Labris. I actually wanted to get in touch with them, but I still didn't have enough guts to go to any of their meetings. I think they mostly had meetings as part of some informal DKF. I remember that what kept me from attending these meetings was the fact that they were held at somebody's place, you know, in private apartments, because obviously the girls didn't have their own space. Or they would meet in this pub, in this now non-existent pub, Wygoda, or in people's homes, and they would watch movies. So when I got back to Poland, I emailed the address provided on that page. I wrote I was from Cracow and I'd like to do something there. But basically it was simply a request for information. And very soon I got back an email telling me that I was the first or perhaps second person who volunteered. So it was great, and could I please start a branch organization in Cracow and become its coordinator? I agreed rather enthusiastically, not really fully aware what I was getting myself into. And by the way, Robert Biedroń, the founder of this organization and its chairman, you know, the person who founded it and has since remained its chairman, didn't then have much of a clue what he got himself into either. All of a sudden, a lot of people from all over Poland were writing to him and starting new branch offices. But then these offices would fall down. For a very long time, the Cracow branch was the only one that generally survived for more than a year and a half. At any rate, I agreed to coordinate work at the branch office. And I remember that the first historic meeting of the campaign was on November 10th, 2001. I think that people who showed up then, and these were two guys, so we had the crowd of 3 at the first meeting, most likely found me through Robert Biedroń. Most likely they just wrote to him asking about the Cracow branch and what could be done there. The only thing I remember is that for a long time we were wondering what kind of an online address we should have. But other than that, there wasn't much else.
Jedyne co pamiętam to, że chyba zastanawialiśmy się bardzo długo, jakie adresy internetowe sobie będziemy zakładać, a poza tym
those beginnings were really terribly improvised. We would meet on Saturdays at St. Wojciech's Church at the Cracow Market Square, which was dubbed as our gathering place, because it's very small, unique looking and easy to spot. And later on we'd go to Cracow's gay pubs, and sometimes just to regular pubs. And waiters often happened to be the ones really interested in the table, where gays and lesbians were being openly discussed. As for this early period, I mostly remember great enthusiasm and terrible chaos, because we were getting very little support from the main office. The only thing that happened was a single meeting of local coordinators, and the rest was up to us. Very soon it turned out that, strangely enough, and without any real will, I joined the all-male club, because the meetings were mostly attended by gay men, which I stopped liking really soon, or rather never really liked.
Cała reszta należała do nas i bardzo szybko okazało się, że
So we had to come up with some way of attracting girls. And very soon the idea came up that the meetings should be exclusively for women, which actually after 2 years of this group's existence was, and the fact that it was happening every 3rd Tuesday of the month, so it was like a regular, holy thing. So up to this point, we can see an interest of the male contingent, and their questions, what are you doing at these meetings? To which they always hear the response that they can do their own meetings if they want.
Są zresztą po 2 latach istnienia takiej grupy i tego, że to się działo.
Counting all the initiatives, there were perhaps as many as 1,000 people who passed through. Anyway, out of the whole crowd of people who would come, stay, come back, not come back, go, send emails, or do something, or not do something, look for a male or female partner, or treat our organization like a singles agency, a group of girls began to emerge who really wanted to do something.
Wysyłał maile, albo coś robił, nie robił niczego, szukał partnera, szukał partnerki, albo traktował organizację jako biuro matrymonialne.
And perhaps, in general, the most important moment, which caused the fact that there were more and more girls, and they were the ones who, in fact, had the best ideas and best coped with all this stuff, was the campaign Niech nas zobaczą, let them see us.
Coraz więcej i tak naprawdę to one miały najlepsze pomysły i najlepiej sobie z tym wszystkim radziły, to była akcja Niech nas zobaczą.
It was more than a year ago, and it was a photograph exhibit of 15 lesbian couples and 15 gay couples, shown in 4 Polish cities, plus a billboard campaign, plus an educational campaign. So basically, already in the fall 2002, it was necessary to begin gathering male and female models. And basically in Warsaw, finding the 15 gay couples went very fast. But it was a real problem to find any lesbian couples in Warsaw, where we looked for them among relatives and friends. At some point, we had this desperate idea to bring women from the Czech Republic, since Czech women could easily pretend to be Polish, so nobody would figure it out if girls from our sister organization in Prague would act as Polish lesbians. But in Cracow, this group of girls included, depending on which meaning, anywhere from 10 to 20-some people. And then I gave a signal. Let's look for models. And we found them in Cracow, as many as 5 couples. And about one of the girls who agreed to participate in the pictures, and who is at this point one of the most active leaders. It was the second time that she attended the meeting. And when the idea popped up that we were taking these pictures and needed models, she came again and decided, why not? And a week later, actually together with me, she was being immortalized for Let Them See Us, with the St. Mary's Church in the background. By the way, there was a really funny story about Ilona, because the majority of reporters assumed that the pictures showed real couples. But among the 30 photos, there were maybe 5 to 6 couples. Ilona and I gave at least 2 interviews as a good couple, having earlier coordinated our testimonies about how long we had been together, what we thought about having children, and so forth.
Uzgadniając zeznania, od kiedy jesteśmy razem, jakie mamy poglądy na temat posiadania dzieci.
Later on, after Let Them See Us, which in general was the first bigger initiative of the campaign, and it took around 7 months to prepare it. And it was also the first initiative to evoke such a strong reaction in Cracow. Because before Let Them See Us, we did have some leaflet campaigns right before Christmas, when on a snowy day we were giving out leaflets with the slogan, "How gay men and lesbians spend their Christmas," to remind everybody that gays and lesbians existed and had to take questions about grandchildren for Christmas. Somehow it didn't touch anybody, but the pictures did touch and upset people. So the whole thing came into being. Well, basically, at that point, they started this rather awful TV show about family values, which has been continued till today, and in which the local right-wing forces are trying at all costs to oppose what's going on in Cracow to benefit gays and lesbians, because they would like the only action going on to be acts of violence against gays and lesbians, or some homophobic conferences like "Why Homosexual Unions Threaten the Future of the Family."
Lokalne siły prawicowe za wszelką cenę próbują się sprzeciwiać temu, co się w Krakowie dzieje na rzecz gejów i lesbijek, bo najlepiej, żeby jedyne, co się działo, to akty przemocy wobec gejów i lesbijek i homofobiczne konferencje typu "Dlaczego związki homoseksualne zagrażają przyszłości rodziny?"
As for me, and as for what it means to be a feminist, or actually have an even stronger link with feminism, as a result of my activities for the gay and lesbian organization, I suddenly found out that it was an occasion to start writing quite a lot, to publish bulletins, for example.
Z okazji tego, że zaczęłam się zajmować działalnością właśnie w organizacji gejowsko-lesbijskiej, nagle dowiedziałam się, że przy okazji takiej organizacji trzeba całkiem sporo pisać i na przykład wydawać biuletyny.
And these bulletins should feature something that makes sense, including a longer piece that would talk about the organization's work, and that even something more like a column would have a right to be there. And I started writing such general-purpose pieces. At first, it was basically and exclusively for practical purposes, even though probably somewhere at the back of my mind there was an old dream, typical for many people who read a lot, and dream about finally being able to read not just what others had written, but also what they managed to write themselves.
Stare marzenie, chyba też marzenie wielu osób, które mnóstwo czytają, żeby móc w końcu przeczytać nie tylko to, co inni napisali, ale też to, co się samemu napisało.
Somehow, for a long time, I managed to forget this dream. And while working on incidental bulletins, all of a sudden, I noticed that a lot of things which were obvious to me were not at all obvious to people who were active in the gay and lesbian community. And that it was necessary to explain a lot of things. Explain, for example, that lesbians existed and had rights, that there was something like a double discrimination of lesbians, that the situation of lesbians in Poland was different from the situation of gays, and that it wasn't necessarily possible to speak about how lesbians had it fine and dandy, when nobody showed any intention to beat up on a couple of girls holding hands, just because they weren't threatened as girls, you know, who are in a relationship.
W momencie, w którym nikt nie przejawia większych chęci do pobicia pary dziewczyn, które trzymają się za ręce, bo i tak nie traktuje ich jako dziewczyn, które są w związku.
All of a sudden, it turned out that with all the activities in gay and lesbian organizations, lesbians would be lost very, very fast and very easily. And also, it quickly turned out that while going to various meetings, participating in seminars or in meetings of coordinators, I was the only girl in the room. Or maybe there was one, possibly two more girls sitting next to me. The rest, on the other hand, was made up of gays, who, well, generally, would take the existence of women into consideration, but weren't necessarily too interested. And by the way, I often heard these comments from people coming to our organization. You're the first lesbian I've seen. And generally, there was this recurring motif that lesbians weren't there, that they were like unicorns, since they were so rare. So suddenly, it turned out that it needed to be explained, to be written about. And I remember one piece I wrote for a bulletin, which most likely was printed, but at any rate, it electronically went out to people connected with feminist organizations and others like gay, lesbian ones. This was a piece I wrote after I got upset by a male friend in a cafeteria, when he was trying to explain to me that discrimination basically didn't exist, and particularly discrimination of women, and neither did discrimination against gays, that everything was okay, and we were all having great fun. Later, it turned out that this friend was a closeted gay, but that's a separate story. And this piece found its way to eFKa and to Beata Kozak, who wrote to me on behalf of Zadra, that she liked the piece quite a bit and she wanted to publish it. And that's how it was in February, 2 years ago. I became the author writing for Zadra. I mean, at that point, I was still treating it as a one-time, random occurrence, as my own, my own whim, And also perhaps, I don't know, perhaps I didn't quite have the courage to follow up on this. Anyway, after that piece, it turned out that more pieces were needed, and that I wanted to write and get some self-realization. When recently I was collecting all these pieces for some application form, I mean everything I managed to produce for the last 2 years, all of a sudden it turns out that basically in every second piece, if not actually in the majority of them, the word lesbian was there, and that in a variety of ways it was always a narrative about this empty place. From many different sides, it was talking about this hiding behind the safe mask of the internet, for example, or about hiding in the gay lesbian organizations themselves, about hiding behind this kind of a theoretical permission to do it, that it was okay, because after all, nobody was going to beat up on 2 girls, which isn't completely true, since somebody was actually trying to beat up on me for something like that once. So it would make sense to have some reckoning with this myth of relative, the myth of relative safety. And it was also the same moment when I had left everything that was going on in Cracow for a while, for a longer while. Because first I went on vacation, and then for the Socrates scholarship. But still, even today, my mind keeps producing ideas for pieces that could have been. It was terribly important for me to participate in the Feminist Academy as one of the lecturers. First what happened was that a year before, while taking some awful final exams, I had this surge of creativity, and I came up with this cycle of 8 or perhaps 9 sessions about lesbian literature. And then it turned out that there was a place where these sessions could be carried out, because the campaign meetings were not really the best place, since these meetings of a group of lesbians were something between a social group and a support group, rather than an appropriate place to come and talk about literary texts. But then it turned out that the Feminist Academy was being launched, and Sławka asked me to participate in the first semester as one of, I think, 4 lecturers. In the second semester, I also had a course somewhat changed in comparison to what it was in the semester before, and it was incredible that we could sit together with other girls and talk about lesbian literature. And I don't know, it wasn't necessary to bang my head against a concrete wall and convince people about the basics, like that women's literature actually existed, and that what women wrote was important, and that when during 4 years in college, a reading list didn't include a single woman writer, something was amiss. Because if it had been the other way around, somebody would have certainly noticed. And this Feminist Academy was also a great, really neat refuge in comparison to what was going on at my college, which is decidedly an unfriendly place. Or at least its Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures is unfriendly to all kinds of research going beyond the defined standard.
siedzieć razem z dziewczynami, rozmawiać o literaturze lesbijskiej i
It means that it's better to work on the Spanish Middle Ages, because basically everything has already been said and discovered, so it's only possible to write some monographic study, or maybe find something about Polish-Spanish relations. But God forbid to specialize in women's literature, let alone lesbian literature. And I committed this kind of crime, because I insisted on writing my master's thesis about a novel, which was the first lesbian novel in Argentina, published in 1981. And what I liked the most about it was that it's a novel about a woman, sitting in a room and writing about a relationship, which was over, and which actually happened in the same room. I liked it particularly because it was kind of a return to the best sources, to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and also basically this very, I don't know, a link to my own, and to how it's often hard to find this room of one's own for writing. And these 500 pounds Virginia Woolf said every woman should have to be able to just write at peace. Somewhere in all of this, there's this serenity, but the place at one's own desk quickly gets lost. Anyhow, it didn't matter that I found a book that fascinated me and the topic that I liked, because basically since October till this moment, and now that there is one more year of entertainment, I mean the editing stage of working at the final draft of this thesis. Anyway, for the whole year my mentor didn't even pronounce the word lesbian, if at all. She talked about relationships between women, and she's trying to persuade me to, I mean between the lines, that if I really had to work on such an awful topic as women's literature, and the starting point was that women's literature didn't exist, then why did I have to focus on lesbians? If it had to be on women, then let them be normal women, heterosexual, and preferably in novels, actually very common in the Latino tradition, about women who suffer because of love, whose love is exploited, and there should also, in the best case, be a husband, a true Latino macho husband. And it would be even better if a husband were to be an important politician, a dictator, because then everything would wonderfully come together. The plot, the dictatorship plot, the Marxist plot, the plot about some hysterical woman who'd immolate herself completely in love. This is what I should have been working on, but not on a woman trying to find her own place somewhere completely beyond this dictatorial framework. There was no place for this at the university, but there was enough room to bring in brain sex. The one and only time my mentor tried to be nice, after I presented to her some theories of French philosophers and theories on women's writing, so she decided it was scientifically proven that women wrote differently and it was in brain sex. So my existence at the university mostly boils down to refuting charges. The biggest charge was that, while writing a thesis on lesbians, I would be writing a sociological analysis of a pathological phenomenon, or something like that. That means that lesbians can't be a topic of literature, but only and solely of sociology, and writing about what is basically abnormal. Even family violence would be more normal, to the extent, of course, that it's committed by a man. And basically it's also that everybody at the university just stopped somewhere more or less in the 60s. And people who have gone any further are decidedly dangerous. That would be all for now. I don't know.
próbuje znaleźć dla siebie miejsce gdzieś zupełnie właśnie poza takim dyktatorskim układem. Na to nie ma miejsca na uniwersytecie, natomiast jest miejsce na to, żeby się powoływać na płeć mózgu, bo jedyny raz, kiedy promotorka próbowała być miła, to stwierdziła, że po moim przedstawieniu o teorii francuskich filozofek i kobiecego pisania, o tym, że więc stwierdziła, że to jest naukowo udowodnione, że kobiety piszą inaczej i właśnie w płci mózgu. Więc moje istnienie na uniwersytecie w zasadzie głównie sprowadza się do odpierania zarzutów. Bo największym zarzutem było to, że pisząc pracę o lesbijkach będę pisać pracę, która będzie socjologiczną analizą patologicznego fenomenu. Czy jakoś tak. To znaczy z lesbijek nie może wyjść literatura. Może wyjść tylko i wyłącznie socjologia i pisanie o tym, co jest w zasadzie nienormalne. To już normalniejsza jest przemoc w rodzinie, o ile oczywiście dopuszcza się jej mężczyzna. I w zasadzie też jest tak, że na uniwersytecie chyba wszyscy się zatrzymali gdzieś tak w latach 60. A osoby, które poszukiwały dalej, są zdecydowanie niebezpieczne. W zasadzie chyba na ten moment tyle, nie wiem.
And how is it? Do you think that any events in your childhood, simply anything that happened during your childhood, is related to this, had a later impact on your feminism?
Wpływ na twój feminizm. No więc tak, to znaczy...
Well, so this is how, I mean, my family had mostly the kind of influence on me and on my feminism as well, that it was mostly, and still is in a sense, a way of not following the path that was theoretically designated for me.
To dalej jest w jakimś sensie sposób na to, żeby nie pójść tą drogą, która teoretycznie została mi wyznaczona. To znaczy ja mam...
I mean, I have 3 younger sisters who are at this point 23, 15, and 11 years old. Well, and at this point in my family, I play a role of some sort of a, perhaps more or less harmless, but a weirdo nonetheless. I mean, for my parents, and particularly for my father and his second wife, a feminist is a frustrated woman who did manage to find a man, and so was I for a very long time, till the moment of my coming out, or actually later on as well. The message was this. Well, studying is important, work is important, but a husband is most important. And perhaps I was amused to tears when, a few years ago, at the time when I already absolutely felt like a feminist, a lesbian, and so forth. But as a gift from my dad, I got the whole series of John Gray's books. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, Mars and Venus in the bedroom. And I think there is a 3rd book in the same cycle. Anyhow, for me this book was like from outer space, and I was reading it with this kind of dismay, as a fictionalized version of brain sex, you know, about men who are sitting in a cave and should not be bothered, and women who are coquettish and kind, and in general, the 2 genders have no chance to communicate. And I was basically completely out of this kind of... But the message was more or less that I should somehow try to fit into it and simply, okay, have some education, but also be the kind of little girl who I don't know, who would dress nicely, would be able to take advantage of the lessons my dad's wife was trying to teach me about what kind of accessories to select, for example, how to do makeup and so forth, and how to do my nails.
Na przykład jakie stroje się do czego dobiera, jak się robi makijaż i tak dalej. Tak, jak sobie należy malować paznokcie, do tej pory nie jestem w stanie tego zrobić.
I still don't know how to do these, but my younger sisters, the ones from my dad's second marriage, my 11-year-old sister has this little box with about 40 nail polishes. And when we come to visit, I mean with my sister who is 23 years old and is my full sister, their favorite way to play is to have a beauty parlor, where for more or less 2 hours we have to bear tortures of having our entire faces made up in something like having our hair twisted in all directions and of course having little patterns done on our nails. And later on I have to struggle to clean it all off. But this is the greatest fun for our little sisters. And we see each other so rarely that it's mostly for them. For my dad and his wife, all I do is usually a complete abstraction. I mean, when I told my dad that, my coming out was like this. I was terribly depressed after my relationship with a girl was over. And Dad was trying to be nice and said that, well, perhaps you feminists are right, after all, and men are pigs. To which I said it was not a relationship with a man, and, which shocked him a little bit, but he soon cheered up and decided that fine, it might be a girl, but there would be grandkids. And somehow he got stuck on these grandkids. I myself heard in passing when he was explaining to somebody at work that his daughter, in spite of her advanced years, that is, when it came to marriage plans, the husband wasn't in the picture, but she would have kids. That is, there would be kids, but there would be no son-in-law. That's how we set it all up. This is perhaps because he can't bring himself up to say that his daughter has a girlfriend. And my mom, she always says that nothing ever reaches Jelenia Góra, the town I'm from. So she probably still feels very embarrassed as well. And the word lesbian is very hard to pronounce, even though once in a while she asks me to say hi to my girlfriend. So it's at least this. And she remembers her name, which is a big accomplishment in comparison to how other parents react. And really, if not for my reading, and if not for my decision at some point that I didn't want to follow an ideal of a woman, according to my father, who divorced my mother mostly because he didn't quite accept the relationship in which a woman would want self-realization. My mom was working on her PhD at the Economic Academy, and later on, because of the divorce, she gave up on her academic job and found work at an elementary school. Because the point was then to work shorter hours, so that she'd be able to regularly come home earlier. And she claimed that academic work was too hard.
Nie bardzo odpowiadał mu związek, w którym, nie wiem, kobieta miałaby siebie jakoś mocno realizować. Moja mama pisała doktorat na Akademii Ekonomicznej, a później w międzyczasie przy okazji rozwodu zrezygnowała z pracy akademickiej i zatrudniła się w szkole podstawowej, bo wtedy chodziło o to, że pracowałaby w krótszych godzinach i tak regularnie byłoby wiadomo, że wróci wcześniej do domu, a stwierdziła, że praca akademicka zbytnio ją obciąża. Natomiast taka
And on the other hand, this ideal of a woman, as seen by my father, is like his second wife, who is 14 years younger than him. She took it upon herself to raise 2 daughters born in the second marriage. She took it upon herself to manage the company when Dad is so burned out with his work that he can't go on anymore. And she took upon herself taking care of children, housework, cooking, and basically the whole life, following some ideal from a magazine for women, which perhaps isn't that bad for someone like her.
No i też w zasadzie życiem w takiej idealnej wersji z tygodnika kobiecego.
But the more I saw this, the more often my nails got painted by my little sisters, and the more issues of Claudia magazine I saw in an apartment, the less willing I was to go for something like this. So this is perhaps the main, my family accepts me mostly thanks to denial. My mom may have perhaps read 2 pieces I have ever written, and my father's family probably nothing. Somehow they were not interested in this, because it's too ideological, I don't know. My feminism is a rather dangerous matter. It's better not to touch it. Women should be women. Men should be real men. And, both genders should basically get involved into this permanent flirtation with one another. And of course, as a result, we'll get these great full families with children. But I have fallen out of this, and it's come out the way it's come out. On the other hand, the 3 other sisters, and particularly the 2 little ones, perhaps are going straight into this model, I don't know, this model of joyful flirtation between 2 genders from distant planets. These 2 little sisters are, not really that little anymore, but because of this age difference of 11 and 14 years, I've learned to think about them as little sisters. For me it was a bit, not maybe odd as much as hard, when as early as 2 or 3 years ago, they started coming up with these stories about boys from class they should be interested in, about Wojtek and Michał and so on. And it was really difficult to get into it with them. But recently, the one who's 15 started having these slightly anarchist flashes. She stopped eating meat and started dressing all in black. So perhaps, if she runs into something that interests her, perhaps somewhere on the way, she'll run into some idea like feminism. But I don't know that.
Zaczęły się opowieści o kolegach z klasy, z którymi należy się interesować, koledze Wojtku, Michale i tak dalej. I strasznie trudno mi się było w to włączyć razem z nimi. Chociaż ostatnio ta, która ma 15 lat, zaczęła mieć takie przebłyski lekko anarchizujące i przestała jeść mięso, zaczęła się zupełnie na czarno ubierać, także być może jeśli trafi na coś, co ją zainteresuje i być może trafi gdzieś tam po drodze nawet na jakiś pomysł, jakim jest feminizm, ale tego nie wiem.
Anya, you are a coordinator for the campaign against homophobia in Cracow, and actually you initiated it. You are the person who cares about something called the lesbian movement, which doesn't really exist in Poland, and which for 99% of the people is, in general, a complete abstraction. And I'm simply wondering where you find this inspiration and strength to act. Are there perhaps some people around you who are giving you this strength? What is it like, in general, to create such a movement? And is it developing the way you want?
I find that this inspiration mostly comes from, I often joke about suffering from a professional English major's affliction, which means that an English major reads everything in print, including cereal boxes, if there is nothing else. Well, of course, I'm trying to select my readings in a way that's somewhat better organized than just reading food boxes. And first of all, the inspiration came from what I was reading, from these piles of books I used to bring from all over, and which I've managed to read here in eFKa, and in bookstores in various European cities. Because the places I always visit when I travel, are modern art museums first, and then bookstores, so that I can read as much as possible. And to sum it up, when I was reading to prepare classes for the Feminist Academy, these elements of the puzzle somehow started coming together. And first they came into a story about what it was all like elsewhere, particularly in the States, but also what it was like in Western Europe, where it started, what it has evolved from, where it's going, and what has happened on the way.
Najpierw pozbierała mi się opowieść o tym, jak to wyglądało gdzie indziej. Przede wszystkim jak to wyglądało w Stanach, ale też jak to wyglądało w Europie Zachodniej. Od czego to się zaczęło, od czego wyszło, w którą stronę idzie, co było po drodze. To znaczy to czytanie.
All this reading and following what happened elsewhere is important because, as a matter of fact, in Poland it's not just a lesbian movement that has to be created from scratch, but in reality any movement on behalf of sexual minorities as well. And what's been happening in the campaign against homophobia is also about comparing to what has happened elsewhere, about comparing these models, which we know from Germany, for example, or from the United States, to what can be done here, to what is possible here. It's about the question, for example, of whether it's possible to have the revolution here like it happened elsewhere, and whether, for example, it's possible here to recreate this utopia from the 70s in the United States. This place called, it's hard to translate into Polish, something like a lesbian state, lesbian nation. At any rate, lesbian nation in English. And the vision of this enterprise, where the very fact that a woman is of a homosexual orientation, will confirm, it will lead up to the fact that it will become a basis for some kind of common policy, common action, thinking and being together. And this utopian vision has really stuck in my memory, even though, of course, it was never really carried out, and it could never be carried out, and particularly some pieces, like perhaps Adrienne Rich's compulsory heterosexuality.
bardzo mocno utkwiła w pamięci i zwłaszcza niektóre teksty, to chyba przymusowa heteroseksualność, Adrienne Rich.
But I was also really incredibly impressed by a piece, which hardly had anything to do with lesbians, or even actually, if I think about it, it was really against lesbians, but was targeted toward this very narrow group, toward this famous white heterosexual middle class in the United States. And The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Anyhow, when I first read it, it was this great revelation, and particularly one thing there. This postulate to that women should take advantage of their capabilities, their intellect, creative, writing capabilities, and so forth, and not to give up on their achievements, And this, and for a long time, this somehow carried me and inspired me very much. Apart from that, well, as far as support from other people is concerned, and in general, when it comes to creating something that could in the future be called a lesbian movement in Poland, I have an impression that support also came from reading, from Furia Pierwsza, from pieces by Joanna Jagiellonska, whom I finally managed to meet 2 years ago at a conference in Warsaw.
Tworzenie czegoś takiego, co mogłoby się w przyszłości nazywać ruchem lesbijskim w Polsce, to mam wrażenie, że trochę to wsparcie brałam też właśnie z tekstów, z Furii Pierwszej, z tekstów Joanny Jagiellonskiej, którą w końcu 2 lata temu na konferencji w Warszawie udało mi się poznać.
It came from knowing that there was a national feminist lesbian archive active in Warsaw for a while, that there was a relatively strong community active on the internet, that there were quite a few short stories, and that there was a place where it was possible to stop by at least for a while to make sure that lesbians could be found somewhere.
I że było miejsce, gdzie można było przynajmniej na chwilę zajrzeć i upewnić się, że gdzieś te lesbijki są.
On the other hand, just to wrap it up, in the campaign it was very important that at some point some girls started to pop up, and they had really good ideas and really wanted to be active. It was, for example, Ilona, this girl with whom I was photographed for Let Them See Us, as well as others, who started to come for the lesbian group meetings and became very involved in our projects, such as Jestem gejem, jestem lesbijką, I am gay, I am lesbian, or Kultura dla tolerancji, Culture for Tolerance. And this was also very, very supportive. I mean, knowing that in some way I wasn't alone in what I was doing. And also at various meetings, I don't know, at conferences. It would suddenly turn out that at some other universities, there were also students who, often shyly and not without huge obstacles, would try to push for the topic of lesbian literature, for example, or for the topic of lesbians in general.
Najczęściej nieśmiało i z dużymi przeszkodami próbują forsować temat literatury lesbijskiej na przykład.
I mean, it's perhaps hard for me to say that it's not one specific person, but more like, I don't know, like scattered little islands, more like the web, like the internet, where basically everything is available. But the point is to know how to get there and how to find it, following these little threads.
Coś bardziej zbliżonego do modelu sieci, do modelu internetu, w którym w zasadzie wszystko jest, byleby się wiedziało, jak dojść i jak po tych nitkach to znaleźć. Także mam wrażenie,
So I have an impression that in Poland, at various places, various occasions, and in various people, some little sparks light up once in a while, and the point is to strengthen these sparks somehow in order to build more on this map with scattered little islands. And also, perhaps, I don't know, another kind of self-perpetuating inspiration was that at some point I discovered I could write, and that I was able to do it quite well. I mean, basically, a lot of incredibly many things were born while I was writing and preparing to write, in this kind of search for ideas and for some way to bring together into one piece all these scattered ideas.
Właśnie, nie wiem, szukaniu pomysłów i szukaniu sposobu na to, żeby te rozproszone idee jakoś zebrać razem w jednym tekście.
And still another kind was that for quite a few years I have spent every summer vacation, basically, somewhere outside of Poland, doing very many different things. From working, well, as a sort of a maid in a kind of an athletic resort in the state of Connecticut, in the States, to being an illegal babysitter in Madrid.
Pokojówki w tym w takim sportowym resorcie w stanie Connecticut w Stanach po pobycie nielegalną opiekunką dla dzieci w Madrycie.
And it mattered that then in Madrid I would divide my time between my babysitting duties to make ends meet and, the daytime was with the kids and evenings in the gay and lesbian area of Madrid to see how it all works there. Also, these trips were inspiring to the extent that they gave me an opportunity to free myself from this at times subconscious baggage of fear I have in Poland to survive. Or these kinds of skills a gay or lesbian acquires in the process of coming out, whether completely or partially, such as deciding who it makes sense to tell, when to tell, and whether it will pay off.
Przetrwać. Znaczy, to są takie umiejętności, które gej i lesbijka nabywa w procesie coming out.
When at some point I need to survive financially in Cracow by teaching English, should I tell? It did happen to me that because the people who had somehow found out my predilection would drop me only and solely because, I don't know, because a lesbian teacher is suspicious and should have no contact with the rest of humanity, particularly when it comes to situations involving only two people, a tutor and a tutee, so to speak.
Rezygnowały z lekcji ze mną tylko i wyłącznie ze względu na to, że nie wiem, nauczycielka orientacji lesbijskiej jest podejrzana.
Then suddenly this fact that my orientation had been revealed would hang between us and would be hard to overcome it. Also, deciding where and when I could even afford to pronounce the words gay and lesbian. Since in a streetcar, for example, it wasn't fully safe. It would often happen to me in situations when, during our campaigns, reporters would call to find out what was going on and to get some quotes for the radio and so on. And since I live far away from the center, I spent a lot of time in streetcars and buses. And I remember being slightly frightened when I was giving these phone interviews in a streetcar or a bus, and the words gay and lesbian would pop up. And I didn't feel fully comfortable with this. But when I traveled, it would suddenly turn out that there were places where everything was much more normal, and when there was much more space.
Pamiętam, jak z taką lekką trwogą właśnie tych wywiadów przez telefon w tym tramwaju czy autobusie udzielałam. No i to słowo gej i lesbijka tam się przewijało i nie do końca się z tym komfortowo czułam. A kiedy wyjeżdżałam, to nagle okazywało się, że są miejsca, gdzie jest o wiele normalniej i gdzie jest o wiele więcej przestrzeni. I są takie miejsca jak na przykład właśnie taki główny plac w dzielnicy lesbijsko-gejowskiej Madrytu, Cracow.
There are places like, for example, Cracow, this main square in a gay and lesbian area of Madrid. A square called Plaza Cracow, where there is this beautiful, colorful gathering of people. Gays, lesbians, transsexual people, transvestites, the queerest kinds of people twisted in every possible way. And basically, it's possible to just come there and simply be, and and not to be afraid. And here in Poland, this fear, justified or not, and luckily sometimes unjustified, always stays somewhere at the back of my mind. So when I can at least remember that somewhere else there is a place like this and people like this, among whom things are more normal, and I don't know, not as ridiculously hard as here, it also helps me to have this kind of awareness.
I tacy ludzie, wśród których jest normalniej, nie wiem, nie jest aż tak ciężko absurdalnie jak tutaj, to też bardzo pomaga, taka świadomość.
Chciałam się zapytać, czy miałaś kiedyś po prostu takie zdarzenie,
I'd like to ask you, did you have an experience in your life when, and I'm not talking about any kind of I don't know, a formal situation, but something more personal, when you trusted somebody and said you were a lesbian and this person simply rejected you?
To znaczy, tak
Yes,
i ciągle.
and I still basically, I mean, my college class, I mean, it was one of the hardest experiences. As a freshman, I'd hang out with people from my class a lot, and I'd go to all possible parties with them. It was when I was still getting ready for a more public coming out. Later on, when I was a sophomore and when I got involved in the campaign against homophobia, I really wanted to talk about it so much, about what I became so fascinated by, and about what I was working on, and that it was so fantastic, and that I was discovering so many new things. Then, first of all, what happened was, it was this more or less openly expressed message. What you're talking about is boring, and we don't want you to bring it up at parties, for example. All this stuff about the organization, about gays and lesbians, because it's embarrassing, and because we don't want to get involved in this stuff and think about it. Later on, it was also, I mean, it wasn't so openly expressed, but I also found out that the fact that I was a lesbian inspired strong and rather negative emotions among my friends, with whom till then I had been hanging out at parties without a problem, because they truly started feeling worried that they could somehow become attractive to me, and that I could, I don't know, somehow follow up on that. And on the other hand, some of them, it seems, I don't know, perhaps they felt such a deep anxiety that it perhaps made them think, I don't know, made them reflect on, or woke up some latent impulses. Once or twice I happened to get these really weird and hardly welcome offers following this type of scenario. It's 3 a.m. and a friend, kind of wasted by then, says to me in this kind of a mumbling voice that basically at this point she could even kiss me. So this was the way my friends were trying to get used to the fact that they had this weirdo amongst them.
I która takim lekko bełkotliwym głosem mówi, że ona w zasadzie teraz to już nawet mogłaby mnie pocałować. Także w ten sposób koleżanki próbowały się oswoić z faktem, że no, takiego dziwoląga mają pośród siebie.
But at some point, I don't know, maybe it was because I didn't let them take advantage of me in this weirdo role, and for example, didn't want to serve as a prop for kissing, enabling them to find out if they liked women or didn't like women after all, and what they would feel when kissed by a lesbian. And also, there was another question that popped up in the background, whether it was safe to be alone with me, whether I wouldn't get crazy, and whether I wouldn't get too attracted to one of them. And probably these early experiments resulted in the fact that somehow I found myself outside this group. I mean, at some point, invitations simply stopped coming. That's all. And at this point, I mean, I have already been given a label of a feminist, a lesbian, and an obsessive activist, because even if I had followed that ban on not talking about gay, lesbian, and feminist issues, my name comes up once in a while anyway. It came up in the local section of Gazeta Wyborcza, for example, and the occasion was the culture for tolerance. Moreover, there is also my wretched master's thesis that I'm trying to write, and with the topic I'm trying to push through. And there is also that, well, that I also Well, did I dare ask these questions like, why for the 4 years of studying Spanish literature hasn't there been a single woman writer? So I function as this horrible feminist out there. And I know that it's somehow talked about within the group, but it never comes back to me at all. So, well, so that's how it goes.
Także gdzieś tam jako ta straszna feministka funkcjonuje i wiem, że to jest jakoś w obrębie grupy komunikowane, ale to już nie idzie w ogóle do mnie. Także, no cóż, bywa.
We'd like to sincerely thank you for your story.